My name is Jean Oy. I'm professor of political science and also the director of the China program at the Asia Pacific Research Center. And today I'm pleased to welcome you to our continuing series that's titled Biden's America, Xi's China, What's Now and What's Next? So we have a very exciting series for this quarter. And in 2 weeks, on February 24th at noon, we'll have Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and senior fellow at Brookings, talking about U.S.-China relations in the Biden era. But today, I'm very pleased to welcome Oriana Mastro, who will be talking about military competition with China, harder to win than the Cold War. And Professor Mastro will be talking about how the changes in technology, geography, and alliance systems complicate U.S. efforts to enhance military deterrence posture against China. And it's particularly a pleasure to have Oriana as a speaker because she actually got her BA in East Asian Studies from Stanford University. And the last time I looked, she was sitting in my Chinese politics class. So she's gone on and done great things. She's got her, she left Stanford and went to Princeton for her MA and her PhD. And this is actually her first year at Stanford. She joined us in August as a center fellow at FSI and with a primary affiliation at APARC and at CISAC. And one of the really unique, I think, and additions about Oriana is that she is also continues to serve in the United States Air Force Reserve, for which she works as a strategic planner at the Indo-Pacific Command. And prior to this, we sort of stole her away from the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And she's written widely, and her book came out a couple of years ago, The Cost of Conversation, Obstacles to Peace Talks in Wartime. And so I'm just delighted to have her speak. So with that, Oriana, I turn it over to you and welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jean, for that great introduction. It has been the past couple of months great to be back at Stanford. As she mentioned, I did get my undergraduate degree in East Asian Studies and started studying China and international security a very long time ago at Stanford. So it's really great to be back home. As Jean mentioned, I do have additional affiliations to my Stanford affiliation. So I just want to clarify that today the comments I'll be making are my own views and do not represent those of any organizations or other government agencies that I have been affiliated with in the past or are currently affiliated with. So today I want to talk about military competition with China and whether it is harder than it was during the Cold War. The big impetus for this current research project I am embarking on was this idea that right now everyone wants to talk about, is the great power competition with China like the Cold War? And I've heard a number of arguments, and I'm sure everyone on this call has as well, about how it is so different, right? We still engage with China. They're a strong economic partner. They are engaged in the international community. They're not trying to overthrow the system, et cetera, et cetera. We also hear ways that it is similar, that, China is revisionist in some ways. We have the military competition, et cetera, et cetera. But all the ways that it is not like the Cold War tend to focus on how things are better, right? How things are better with China than they were with the Soviet Union. I had some suspicions, however, doing my research for my book, that there were a lot of ways our relationship, and especially in the military side, are more difficult with China than the Soviet Union. So I'll just provide this one anecdote that really surprised me. And I must sort of confess that I'm a China expert. So I come to this issue as a China expert, not as an expert in the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of individuals who now write about China who actually know much more about the Soviet Union. That is not me. So this was very surprising to me. But I was in the archives reading through some messaging between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Vietnam War. And during this war, we would, the Soviets would complain that we would engage in bombings while they had military people on the ground advising the North Vietnamese, and we would apologize, but say we had to do that, because certain supply routes were of a threat to our forces. And this type of interaction, like the diplomatic exchanges, direct exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States, I thought to myself, I have never heard China and the United States talk to each other this directly. There is still so much more difficulty in many cases of communicating intentions, resolve capabilities than there seemed to be in the case of the Soviet Union. So this really inspired this current research agenda, which is trying to look at deterrence theory and the ways that we can enhance deterrence and defeat aggression if absolutely necessary in the case of China. And if there are lessons to be learned from the Cold War, are some of those lessons that, this is actually much worse than it ever was with them. So the beginning of this project is the assumption, and I think it's a relevant assumption, that the goal of US military strategy has been to deter and defeat Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. If you look at our national security strategy, the 2017 national security strategy, it very clearly says that the United States needs to have this capability, a forward military presence, capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating any adversary. And there have been many studies on the balance of power between China and the United States. I myself have conducted a number of them, whether it is, China and the United States in the South China Sea, China and the United States vis-a-vis Taiwan, that look at, these specific issue areas. And that evaluate the performance of each side in particular contingencies. But I think today, since we think about the US-China relationship as a great power competition, and this is a term I use and others use to say and describe the struggle between powerful states to shape the world or the regional orders in a manner that's favorable to them, it's also important to think about it more broadly beyond just the particular contingency. And the main argument that I'm going to posit in this talk today is that militarily, it is more difficult to deter China and defeat China than it ever was vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, as a side note, a caveat, of course, there are ways in which it is easier now to meet these objectives than there were during the Cold War. For example, the geography of the Asia Pacific is less conducive to a rapid fait accompli than Central Europe's geography during the Cold War. The United States never believed that it could defend the German border against Soviet aggression without conflict escalating to the nuclear level, for example. But in my talk today, I will describe how we have that expectation that we could have a hot war with China and keep it conventional and limited. Also, both China and military planners have alluded to this fact that it is much easier nowadays to keep it at a more limited conventional level than it was during the Cold War. So there are indeed, of course, ways that the Cold War relationship, military competition with the Soviet Union was, quote unquote, easier. But I think in terms of where this debate is, there's a lot of ways it's harder that haven't really been fleshed out. So first, there's sort of two things I want to talk about in this talk. The first one is about establishing a credible deterrent, and related about coalition building. Now, for those of you who might not have an extensive background on deterrence theory, I'll just sort of lay out a few of the main principles. Right? Deterrence is the art of coercion and intimidation. It is about having the power to hurt as bargaining power, and basically threatening the other side that you will use this power if they do something that you do not like, but you're holding this power in reserve. And successful deterrence, according to deterrence theory, requires the threat of an unacceptable cost to the other side, and that threat is credible. Now, during the Cold War, the United States did many things to try to ensure that our threat that we would use force against the Soviet Union if they attacked our European allies would be credible. And one of the issues in Beijing is that there is a degree of uncertainty about whether or not the United States has the resolve to fight on behalf of its allies. So it's important for a deterrent for the United States to credibly signal we have this resolve. Now, what is one of the main ways we did this during the Cold War? During the Cold War, we did something what we call a tripwire strategy, which is the United States forward deployed military personnel to be on the ground at those borders. And why this made it more credible that the United States would get involved is the Soviet Union would have had to overrun US forces in order to attack our allies. The idea was, in this scenario, after the Soviet Union had overrun and therefore killed American forces, it was very credible that the United States would respond with force. Now, a lot of people talk about this type of method in the Indo-Pacific theater, but actually it is impossible to do this in the different contingencies we're considering. Now, we do have this sort of tripwire on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, South Korea conflict is the only conflict really that is potentially going to be land-based. But in the Indo-Pacific, most of the contingencies the United States are planning for against China are in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and across the Taiwan Strait. These are primarily air and sea battles. And there's no effective way for the United States to position aircraft and surface vessels in such a way that that China has no choice but to engage them, right? Waters are very big. South China Sea is, the size of half the continent of the United States. It is impossible for us to set up some sort of naval or airline, to cover all the airspace and all the sea space. So China can always go around us, which means that the United States still always has an independent decision about whether or not to get involved in a conflict. It's always a separate independent decision. And therefore, the forward deployment of US forces into the Asia Pacific area of operation does not signal or does not enhance the credibility of US resolve to fight like it does during the Cold War. China also has more non-lethal but effective uses of force than the Soviet Union ever did, such as cyber or outer space, counter space capabilities. In recent decades, also the United States has become so much more reliant on these realms to project power. This makes even a non-lethal attack potentially devastating operation. So for example, during the Iraq War, the United States used 42 times the bandwidth that they used during the first Gulf War. And so now the United States military, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A if people are interested, are heavily reliant on what we call C4ISR, command control computers, communication, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, sensors and systems that are connected in many cases through satellites or data uplinks and through our computers. And China has really advanced capabilities to disrupt them. And when they are disrupted, not only are the flow of forces, US forces in a region disrupted, but things like targeting or the honing of a missile to its target are also disrupted. And so it's very hard to deter China from using non-lethal means, and in many cases actually reversible means, to win a conflict when in some cases no one is actually killed. Right? For example, counter space, they can do things that render a satellite disabled for a certain period of time, but then the satellite's back online later. So the United States has struggled with coming up with what we call cross-domain deterrence. What can we threaten that is credible to keep China from doing these things? But the bottom line is the benefits of attack in these domains are so high, basically successfully preventing US intervention in a conflict in Asia, and the costs so relatively low that it's impossible to come up with some sort of threat that will levy an unacceptable cost on China, but that is also credible. Those high cost strategies, I think by nature are incredible. So for example, if you said to China, if you attack, our satellite, so we can't, deploy our systems effectively, then, we might use a nuclear weapon. Yes, that cost does enhance the deterrence, but that is a completely incredible threat. No US president is going to authorize that, thereby undermining the deterrence. And so this cross-domain deterrence issue is something that we're facing with China that we never had to face with the Soviet Union. Nuclear escalation threats are even less credible. Now, a lot of people will say China has nuclear weapons, the United States has nuclear weapons. We'll never see a conflict between these two sides. And if you kind of hear a hint of the foreshadow of my argument, it's one of the main reasons that it's not useful to think about the China-US competition like the Cold War is that there is a much higher possibility of a hot war between these two sides than there ever was between the Soviet Union and the United States. And that's because the Soviet Union and the United States had what is often referred to as a mutually assured destruction relationship. Right? Both sides knew that if nuclear weapons were used, it would be the end of both countries. And that was a significantly powerful deterrent. China, ever since the beginning of its nuclear weapons program, has decided to go a different way. I would argue a much more reasonable and logical way than the United States, which is they have a minimum credible deterrent. They think we just need a handful of weapons. The United States is deterred by, just the possibility of one nuclear weapon. We don't need to be able to destroy the world, 10 times over. What that means is, for the Chinese, they have had a no first use doctrine, which means they will never use nuclear weapons first, and they will never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. That's also part of their doctrine. But they plan on absorbing a nuclear attack before they launch one, right? And so this creates a different type of dynamic. There's no longer the fear that any conventional conflict would actually escalate to the nuclear level. Now, there are some non-China specialists who focus on functional area of expertise like nuclear weapons or great power competition, who theoretically or in a logical sense would say, maybe China, maybe this no first use doctrine is not a real thing, or it's possible that if they felt like their nuclear weapons program was adequately threatened, then they would use nuclear weapons first. I guess any hypothetical is possible, but if you look at their doctrine, but also their training, they actually train their forces to absorb before they launch. And until recently, they've always had a policy of launching on attack and not warning, which means they would only launch after an attack, not just if they've heard a warning. Though given the current asymmetries between US and Chinese nuclear capabilities, they are rethinking that. So the escalation to the nuclear level is just less credible because there is not the same level of Chinese nuclear threat against the United States. China has this very reasonable policy, which basically says we will not use nuclear weapons unless the United States uses them first. And so during the Cold War, while, of course, to a degree, the use of nuclear weapons was always somewhat incredible. And so the United States and the Soviet Union did a lot of things like, automating the decision-making to make it more and more credible. It is even less credible because we don't have a mutually assured destructive relationship with China. And moreover, the things we're fighting about, China is not trying to occupy US allies, right? Taiwan, an informal ally, is the exception. But most of the territories under dispute between the United States and its allies in Beijing are actually relatively unoccupied. Right? So West Berlin had a population of 2 million people. The disputed Spratly Islands has maybe a population of the low hundreds. So again, this idea that over conflict over those islands would escalate to the nuclear level is just less credible. And what that means is without that nuclear deterrent at the higher level, there's less deterrence at the lower levels. There's no longer this fear. If we start a conventional conflict, that means we have to be prepared for nuclear war, which opens up the space for more hot wars at the lower level. Another reason I think deterrence is more difficult concerns what the United States is trying to deter. The United States is trying to deter China from establishing a sphere of influence in Asia, which is predicated on Beijing regaining territory it considers its own. But in the Cold War, the United States did grant Russia a sphere of influence, right? The United States never attempted to deter Russia from joining with 14 other republics to become the Soviet Union. The United States also basically conceded the occupation of Eastern Europe and reacted very tepidly to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So, in other words, the United States was attempting to prevent the Soviet Union from further peripheral expansion. But by definition, Moscow had its sphere of influence and it had expanded to the areas that were most core to its interest already. And then we were trying to deter further expansion. But in China's case, the United States is, and I think this is the right policy, so I don't mean to criticize it, but the United States is unwilling to concede a parallel sphere of influence. And Beijing sees it necessary, right, unification with Taiwan, control over what we refer to as the first island chain, the waters in the South China Sea and East China Sea, for its national survival. And so the benefits to Beijing of expanding to these core areas are so much higher, right? Taiwan matters much more to Beijing than Paris did to Moscow, right? Those were peripheral areas that they might expand to. And so while president after president has attempted to rebalance U.S. military efforts to the Asia Pacific, it's also the case that the American people have been slow to get on board. If we want to show the credibility of U.S. resolve to fight in a contingency against China, it's not helpful that, recent Chicago poll said that 61% of Americans still believe the Middle East is the most important area of the world for U.S. security interests. Only 12% of the American public believes Asia is even important to national security interests. And given that response, it's probably an even lower percent that would say it's worth fighting a war with China to protect allies and partners and maintain the U.S. position there. And so the Soviet Union was also, much more a bigger threat to partners and allies of the United States, which made it easier for the United States to signal that it would be willing to fight on behalf of those countries. And since the American people saw the Soviet Union as an existential threat, which China is not to the United States, as much as the Trump administration tried to get some of those ideological debates back up to to convince the American people otherwise, or convince, even populations around the world otherwise. China is not an existential threat or an ideological threat in the same way. And so it's harder to signal that the United States would be willing to absorb really high costs associated with these types of fights. But since I mentioned partners and allies, I want to pivot to the second component, right? The first is there are a number of reasons why it's harder for the US deterrent to be credible, right? That China, we can't have tripwires. China has options for non-lethal but effective uses of force. Nuclear escalation threats are less credible. And what we're trying to deter is a lot harder than it was during the Cold War. The second component of why military competition is harder is about building a coalition. A key part of the challenge of regional defense involves rounding up a strong group of partners committed to opposing Chinese hegemony. And this includes their willingness to provide the United States with operational support that Washington may need in terms of military access, force posture, logistical, economic, and diplomatic support in a crisis. It is much harder to build such a coalition now in the military competition with China than during the Cold War against the Soviet Union for several reasons. First and foremost, history has happened. So what that means is China looked at what happened to the Soviet Union, and in particular, the countervailing coalition that the United States formed with Western, largely like Western prosperous democracies, and in some cases, autocracies that were still in existence in Asia at that time, formed against the Soviet Union, which made it harder for them to compete. So China's grand strategy and foreign policy strategy has had the primary goal of preventing a countervailing coalition from forming against it. And they've been very adept at this. China has tried to pursue, for example, partnerships instead of alliances so as to not alienate US partners and allies. They've engaged in close economic cooperation with partners and allies so that they see the benefit of continuing to work with China and the downsides of potentially alienating or upsetting China. China also asks a lot less of countries than the United States or the Soviet Union ever did when it's trying to build its partnerships and deep, partnerships with other countries. So the United States is asking countries in Asia to potentially put their security and prosperity on the line to support US efforts in a contingency. China, in contrast, is not asking for any support. So unlike the Soviet Union, which both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, were making demands on other countries in their alliances, what China is asking of countries in the region is basically neutrality, just not to do anything, right? Because militarily, and this goes to the geography question, the Soviet Union was trying to project power across vast distances. They wanted to be a global military power. China does not have those same ambitions. And I'm sure this is always a point that comes up a lot in Q&A. I think China wants to be a global power, but they are happy to rely on political and economic means to exert influence in regions such as the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. I do not believe they have the same plans to have a global power projection network as the United States and to have foreign military intervention as a key tool of their foreign policy, largely because they see it as ineffective and draining, and that if they're dominant in Asia, that makes them a superpower, right? They don't have to be dominant militarily in Africa to be a superpower. Asia is the economic, political, diplomatic center now of the world. And so they think they just have to be dominant there. So I do believe they want to have that military hegemony in Asia, but not in the rest of the world. So what this means is that, the United States has to project power from the United States to China. And meanwhile, China doesn't have to. So militarily, they can operate effectively from their own bases. And so when it asks only basically for neutrality, this is so much easier politically for regional leaders to grant in the case of a conflict. And in all likely contingencies, China plans on fighting whoever they're fighting, directly, and maybe the United States, but they've worked very hard to ensure that other countries, even US allies, remain neutral in any sort of conflict. And so what this means is that as power projection, this is so core to the US role in Asia. And this is so much harder for the United States in Asia than it was in Europe because to a great degree of the sprawling geography of Asia, right? The vast distances that the United States has to project power in Asia, make it very, very difficult. So for context, the South China Sea is larger in square miles than all of Western Europe. And to prevail in any conflict against China, the United States is going to have to operate from bases and places in the region, but securing pledges of support from countries in the region that would not be directly involved in that contingency have been all but impossible. Partners and allies in Asia have not formed any sort of multilateral mutual defense organization like NATO, and even the two closest US allies, Japan and South Korea, consistently refuse to work together to broaden any meaningful defense cooperation. Part of this is the complex history between these countries, part is aggression, and the ability of the United States to build such coalition, or the Chinese belief that the United States could build such coalition if they, for example, attack Taiwan, is so central to the US deterrent. And this is partially because the PRC has relatively more resources to draw close even US allies. And Beijing does not present a clear and existential threat to most countries in the region. Right? We do not like that China more and more is relying on coercion, but I'm willing, to bet my life that they don't want to occupy Japan, right? Occupation is no longer kind of part of the goal. Yes, they have this dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and they most likely, want to occupy those, but it's not the case that we're thinking that in this military competition, we have to protect South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, or Australia for full-on Chinese occupation. And so what this means is that these countries, while they do choose the United States as a security partner of choice, it isn't an existential threat. And so it's not worth the type of trade-offs necessary economically. The cost of alienating Beijing in peacetime are so significant to any player, right? The number one trading partner of most of US allies and partners is China. This obviously was never the case in the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union was completely isolated from US allies and partners. The European Union is similarly economically interlinked with China. The EU just finalized an investment agreement with China. And so the Soviet Union did not have this kind of power or opportunity over US allies during the Cold War, as there was little trade between them. So China doesn't present the same level of threat to countries in the region as the Soviet Union did, and they present much more opportunity than the Soviet Union did. China has vast economic resources that it can bring to bear in this military competition to potentially buy off potential partners of the United States. But also, these economic resources is another reason why it's difficult to compete. I forget the exact numbers, but in terms of investing in military modernization, right? We know that China is investing, billions and billions of dollars. And the Soviet Union largely collapsed because of internal economic issues. And if you look at the proportion of Soviet spending on their military versus US spending on their military, right? In 1961, for example, the ratio of Soviet to American gross national product went from 48% to about 51% in 1969. So they were about, half the size of the US economy. And during the height of the Cold War, the United States spent about 9% of its GDP on defense, while we spend 3% now. Now, those numbers might have been a bit confusing, so let me just lay it out for you. The Soviets had half as many economic resources as we did during the Cold War to put towards military modernization, and we spent about 3 times more as a percentage of our GDP on defense than we are spending today, right? China has the resources, and we are spending a lot more in the competition. So it's not the case like it was with the Soviet Union that we can outspend them. And so the default for many countries in the region is basically to stay relatively neutral. But unfortunately, neutrality, again, from the US position, because we rely on access to other countries to be able to operate in the region. Without that access, the United States military cannot operate in a sustainable way. Neutrality means siding with Beijing, in effect. And this is just Asian allies that might potentially be more threatened by Chinese military growth. Obviously, European allies are even more reluctant to involve themselves. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union did present a threat to US allies in both theaters. But today, China does not present a real military threat to Europe. Now, people might say the threat perceptions in Europe have changed recently, and they've gotten a bit harsher on China, and that's true. But that's mostly because of domestic political interference issues. I think China severely miscalculated on this issue, and it does create a perception of threat in some European capitals. But it's not a traditional military threat. And so there is no discussion, should NATO, will the UK or France or whatever be fighting China over Taiwan, right? European countries do not fear direct attack from China, and they do not fear Chinese invasion, and I think rightfully so. And so this disparate threat perceptions makes it harder than it was during the Cold War for the United States to coordinate any allied support in its military competition with China, even in peacetime, since the potential wartime dynamic very much influenced peacetime thinking. Now, I think I alluded to this. During the Trump administration, the United States tried to leverage ideological differences to encourage coalition building, right? In a speech on the future of the free world, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned that China was more dangerous than ever, that China, quote, is increasingly authoritarian at home and more aggressive in its hostility to freedom everywhere else. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said, we should not be concerned only for the Chinese people, but for ourselves. Xi Jinping's ambitions for ideological control are not limited to his own people. But appealing to these ideological differences is also more difficult now than it was during the Cold War. Yes, China is a communist autocratic regime, like the Soviet Union was. But unlike the Soviet Union, they have no desire to overthrow democratic regimes or to prop up client states around the world. China has no real allies to defend, has never deployed troops abroad outside of multilateral constructs like the United Nations or the Gulf of Aden anti-piracy mission. It does not leverage arms sales as a main tool of influence. And for all these reasons, even though the United States has tried this rhetoric of they are dangerous because they are an autocracy, or they are authoritarian, most countries, they don't like the growth of the Chinese military. They think it's a bad thing, but it's not the same level of ideological threat, primarily because China is not trying to, replace democracy with autocracy in the same way the Soviet Union did. I think, this is anecdotal. There was a recent New York Times story, for example, of how many Chinese students, go back and want to go back to China after they study abroad. I think it's telling that the Soviet Union had to put up a wall, to keep people in. China does not have to do that. So I don't mean to be apologetic for the regime, but I think the nuance and the different levels of control is important. A lot of conservative strategists refer to China as a totalitarian regime. And of course, there are totalitarian pockets, right? If you are Uyghur, if you are Tibetan, especially minority pockets, then you are experiencing a totalitarian, autocratic, communist single party regime. But in a lot of China, there is a degree of a higher degree of freedom that existed during the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And the ideological threat in terms of China trying to push that threat out to the world just isn't there. So, to sum it all up, pundits and scholars alike are currently debating whether the competition with the United States and China resembles that between Washington and Moscow during the Cold War. In this discussion, what I've tried to do is highlight one reason I think such a comparison is problematic and potentially counterproductive. In some ways, it is more difficult to deter and defeat China's aggression in the region. So I think what this means is that the United States has to avoid relying on the same Cold War tools and strategies of competition, even if they were effective decades ago, right? Trying to convince Beijing that Washington is willing to pay the same costs to defend Taiwan that they're willing to pay to gain Taiwan is not going to work, right? Instead, the United States needs to have such a preponderance of military power that it can credibly communicate that, yes, it's not willing to pay such high costs, but it won't have to because of its military capability, that it can fight a war at an acceptable cost. Ensuring the United States is the security partner of choice in the region is no longer sufficient to compete with China, as many countries have these strong economic relationships with China. Instead, I think we have to rethink our alliances and demonstrate to partners that we can protect them not only from military attack, but also other types of costly behavior that Beijing might leverage against them, such as economic coercion, right? As I said before, I don't think the threat is, Chinese invasion of Australia. It is that, China stops buying Australian wine. Currently, China is engaged in an economic coercion campaign against Australia. And there's nothing in our alliance that suggests the United States should do anything about that. I think we have to retool and rethink our alliances to build resiliency among our partners across the spectrum, not just against military attack. So these are only a few examples to highlight how Cold War thinking, I think, is a way to lose the competition with China, and why this is not a useful framework thinking about what we are currently facing vis-a-vis China, and we have to think more innovatively in terms of how to deal with what is indeed, in some cases, a military threat. But of course, the great power competition, China is not a threat in all aspects, in all areas. And that is one of the main reasons why this is actually much more difficult than it was during the Cold War. So I will conclude there and open it up to any questions anyone in the audience might have.
Thank you, Oriana. That was very interesting and very thought-provoking. Let me just start out, because in your comments, I think you rightly stress the importance of the economic factor, particularly in terms of the why it's more difficult to form coalitions against China. But I'm wondering also about your first point regarding the sphere of influence. I mean, in a sense, isn't that also perhaps why? Because the fact that China is its economic strength and is an economic competitor with the United States, whereas in the Soviet Union, it was a competitor, but not necessarily economically.
So the question is sort of like, why are we unwilling to concede this sphere of influence? I think,
yeah, in other words, right, because you said that we allowed the Soviet Union to, but not China, and I'm asking, is that also in large part because of the economic implications?
So I think that makes sense from a logical point of view, but I think a lot of it more has to do with some narrow military thinking on these issues. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the change of perceptions of U.S. power in the post-Cold War period. Right. So what after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States had such overwhelming, military superiority vis-a-vis anyone else. The U.S. military and the defense establishment became very sensitive and unaccepting to the idea that anyone could possibly threaten the United States in any way. Right. So even China, when it first started developing capabilities, that everyone was like, oh my gosh, they called it this anti-access area denial strategy, which was just the fact that China could actually hit one of our airplanes, right? Or they could hit one of our ships, right? Because for decades, and even now in Iraq and Afghanistan, what people don't realize is, there's no dogfight. There's no other aircraft up there with us, like fighting us. And so there was a whole decade, I think, in the Pentagon in which people were trying to strategize, can we go back to where China can have no impact on us? And then they kind of people were like, well, this is a country that has options, and so that's no longer reliable. So I think part of the idea of like we can't concede any of this space is that the United States doesn't have to make those kinds of concessions. And now we're in a situation where making those concessions also has operational risks associated to it, because China wants that space because it makes it even harder for the United States to deter them. Right? That's why China wants that space. The U.S. is a force of good in the world, according to me, an American with a military affiliation, right? Like, I have very optimistic and positive views of the United States. But we have to be realistic that there's some countries in the world that do not trust U.S. decision-making, and China is one of them. They don't think the United States will only attack them if they do something horribly wrong. They think the United States might attack them just to maintain its position in the world. And so being surrounded by the U.S. military, which is what China has been, if you look at where U.S. bases are in our operations, does not make China feel secure. So one of the main reasons they want that, sphere of influence, basically control over the waters in the South China Sea and East China Sea, is to push the U.S. military farther back, so that every time the United States gets upset about something, we don't go threaten them with military stuff, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with this military history of the Taiwan Strait crisis of 95, 96. They feel like they're dealing with this internal issue in Taiwan. The United States sends an aircraft carrier close to the strait to say, stop it. And at that time, they had no option but to stop. And so the lesson they learned was, let's not let that happen again. Next time, let's have an option. And that's how they developed the system at aircraft carriers. So I think a large part of it just has to do with it was too late for us with the Soviet Union. After World War II, I mean, all that kind of stuff happened in the midst of all these other conflicts and crises. So by the time we were competing with the Soviet Union, it was already a done deal, and we couldn't get them to roll it back. But now with China, we're in this situation where the growth has been more gradual.
Okay. We have a lot of questions, and a lot of them actually are on Taiwan. And so there are a couple that are related. One, this former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has stated that he believes we'll be at war with China over Taiwan within this decade. And then another similar related one is, how would you weigh Taiwan's role in this seemingly combative relation between the US and China? Unlike the Cold War, nowadays Taiwan holds a few highly impactful resources such as advanced semiconductor manufacturing, etc. And the question is, would Taiwan ever become the fuse of a US-China hot war?
So it's hard for you to start with this question because now I'll just sound like this huge pessimist, because there's so many areas where I think, cooperation, engagement with China is absolutely, the way to go. There's so many positive sides of this relationship. One being, there's no hostility between the American people and the Chinese people. As you know, spending time in Beijing, and I spend time in Beijing, we just have differing viewpoints on things. We have conflicts of interest, but this is not, existential ideological competition. That being said, I don't agree with most of what the past administration did in terms of I thought they were undermining the U.S. ability to compete with China, but I do agree with that assessment about Taiwan. For a number of reasons, I think it is very likely that China is going to use force against Taiwan within the next 7 to 8 years. And so let me just sort of lay out what changed my thinking on this. For many years, Taiwan was not center focused. Things were relatively stable across the strait. China kind of wanted to keep the status quo. The United States wanted to keep the status quo. Every once in a while, there were little flare-ups of movements maybe towards independence, but it was relatively stable. What happened, I think, in Beijing is sort of twofold. They had this policy of peaceful reunification that they thought with more engagement, economic interdependence, the people of Taiwan would realize it's better to be a part of mainland China than not. And recent sort of discussions, I had before COVID hit, track 1.5 with the Chinese on this issue. They are more and more becoming skeptical of the effectiveness of that approach. I mean, they see the same polling we do in Taiwan, that the viewpoint of the Taiwan people is more and more that they do not want unification with Beijing. That policy does not seem to be working from their point of view. And for the first time, they have now military capabilities to take Taiwan. So people maybe don't realize is, when I first started studying this issue, I edited a book on cross-strait military balance. And at that time, the Taiwan invasion plan was for China to commandeer some fishing vessels and paddle their way over to the island, right? We were not concerned, right? We're okay. So the question was always, were we or Taiwan going to do something to spark a reaction? China had to do something. Taiwan declares independence. They're going to get those fishing vessels and march on over. But now I don't think the viewpoint is that we spark something. It is that they are now looking for an opportune time to do it. So now for the first time, they just finished their military reforms last year. I think they want maybe a handful of years to continue to do exercises to really hone their joint operations capability. But for the first time, their military can now launch an amphibious assault on Taiwan. I don't mean to suggest that means that they'll do it, but I think it changes their thinking that that's an option. And then something else that kind of changed my viewpoint on this, Xi Jinping had made statements that he wanted to see progress towards unification. Different than maintaining the status quo, preventing independence was no longer good enough. He wanted to see progress towards unification. I dismissed all these statements because I thought, well, he'll be out of office, in a couple of years, so no one's going to hold him to this. So once he actually got rid of those term limits, those statements took on a different meaning. And some of which he said, he's not going to pass this down generation to generation. And I'm sure, Jean, you've talked to people in Beijing too. I mean, it seems to me that the conventional understanding from the average Chinese person that I speak to is that this issue will be resolved, meaning unification, before she steps out of office. And so a recent Global Times poll, which is a very nationalistic Chinese newspaper, asked the Chinese people, what do you think about this Taiwan issue? And the vast majority said they think it should be resolved in 3 to 5 years. The second most popular answer was 1 to 2, of which 75% of those that responded said that they felt like it would require a major war, and that they were on board with that. So armed reunification is becoming much more popular in Beijing. And I think, that is what we need to be trying to deter. And that's also much harder to deter because it's about capabilities. I think this idea, like our resolve to defend Taiwan, I mean, the Chinese are planning for our involvement, and they still might do it anyway if we don't have the military capabilities to prevail. So for all these many reasons, I'm worried about Taiwan.
Okay, well, there's another question, a related question on this. So I'm just going to continue down this path for a few minutes. Because you also talked about, the changes in capabilities and strategies, including things like cyber attacks and such. But this person is asking, so basically what you just said. So you think that this is actually going to be an actual physical invasion as opposed to a cyber attack or blockade, and would you say that the cyber attack would not achieve the goal? And then also going on, sort of the question question is about making it too costly for China to intervene. What would make it too costly? I mean, isn't this going to be a concern?
I'll start with the costly issue. I mean, I firmly believe if you told Xi Jinping today, you could take Taiwan, but you'd lose your whole Navy, he would do it. I think the cost side is hard because the benefit of retaking Taiwan, and also side note, that means you've defeated militarily the United States. That is such a huge benefit that the costs are hard. So I would say deterrence by denial is probably more effective. You want to shake Xi Jinping's confidence that he will succeed. You could try to take Taiwan, but you might fail. That looks bad domestically. That looks bad, with the military. That is what imposes caution on him. Not so much the cost of it, but whether or not he will succeed. One caveat to the cost conversation is that, we always focus on the vertical escalation, that we can impose costs on China. One type of cost that I do think is effective is horizontal escalation. China does not want a countervailing coalition to form, especially, in this conflict or over the long term against their rival. But their diplomacy has worked very hard to convince countries that Taiwan is a unique issue, right? How they treat Taiwan is not indicative of what type of country they are more broadly. So they think they'll be relatively effective at other countries kind of staying neutral and saying, this is, we're staying out of it. If they felt like the United States could actively and, successfully build a coalition against them in wartime, but also, peacetime, whether it be economic sanctions or other types of things for this behavior, I think that would deter them. So I think horizontal escalation is possible, is a deterrent, but it's just a lot harder.
So the best deterrence? I mean, what might the U.S. do to prevent this? And your scenarios are increasingly likely that this is going to happen.
Yeah. So I think, we have to, first of all, have certain military capabilities to get into specific. We need land-based missiles in the second island chain. Anyone on the line who's very interested in operational specifics? Basically, we need to be able to saturate the strait with firepower such that no matter how much resolve they have to get across, they cannot get across. Right? Now, to the previous question of, why am I talking about a full-on amphibious assault when there are so many options that China has of basically coercion, right? I think the standard, playbook has been, it's better to coerce Taiwan to capitulate versus this brute force kind of amphibious invasion. The credibility of U.S. deterrence and our ability to defend, ironically, work at cross purposes. So what I mean is the more credible our deterrent, the harder it is for us to win. So let me lay out why this is the case. If our deterrent is credible, so China thinks 100% the United States is going to get involved, then they take out our bases first, right? They're going to have to fight the United States anyway. They take out our bases. We cannot operate. They can take Taiwan before we can even bring forces in that we need to defend. If they are not, so they don't want to do joint missile campaigns. blockades, right, to give Taiwan time to capitulate. Because what this does is give the United States time to move more forces into the region. And they absolutely know that if the United States is given time to prepare to fight the war the way we want to fight it, the United States will win. But they don't want to fight the United States if they don't have to. So if our deterrent is weaker and that they're uncertain about whether or not we will be involved, then they might want to lean on the side of avoiding that involvement, which means you don't attack the United States, in peacetime unprovoked. You're not going to launch an attack on a U.S. base because that means the United States is going to get involved. So if they think that the United States might not get involved, that means they don't attack the United States first, and they think they have time, then they will start with some of those lower level joint missile campaign, blockade types of options. So it's really dependent on what their perception is on the U.S. willingness to get involved in the contingency, which direction that they're going to go.
And so a question following that, a question just came in. Can't the U.S. give Taiwan sufficient missile technology such that the response to an invasion would be extremely costly to China?
So in terms of missile technology, if it is kind of like a coercive thing, like, then Taiwan can attack mainland China. The problem with that on the cost side is, and there's no really elegant way to put this, right? China is a target sponge. China is so big and has so many targets that the United States could drop, obviously, short of nuclear weapons, like all the munitions that we have, and still not destroy their capacity to continue fighting. If the United States doesn't have that capability, it would be really hard to give Taiwan an adequate number of these types of systems that it could really knock out the operational capability. Now, if you're saying, attacks on Chinese cities, for example, like could the cost be high enough more in terms of the civilian side? This is something that has been debated a lot for U.S. strategy in terms of air-sea battle, or some of these sort of joint concepts, because for a long time we're talking about these wars. They are across the strait, right? Even the United States, until very recently, wasn't considering targets on the Chinese mainland. And so that opens up a whole nother type of war. So there's kind of a debate of, if we escalate this to a very high level of conflict, in some ways the United States has an advantage, but in others we don't, because we don't have the same resolve that Beijing does. And so if then, we're like U.S. homeland, Chinese homeland is kind of involved, that I think makes it even harder for us to prevail. But if the question is more like, then they have certain capabilities, to blunt the invasion force, right? It's not targeting, it's not a coercive capability against Chinese cities, but it's against, the landing dock coming in, that is the direction that the United States is trying to push Taiwan, is towards these more what we call asymmetric capabilities, right? Mining capabilities, missile capabilities. The problem is the United States cannot technically help Taiwan with those capabilities because our commitment is to only provide Taiwan with defensive weapons, and missiles are offensive weapons. And we also have some international law commitment about the proliferation of missile technology. And so I would say that operationally, that is good. But politically and for legitimacy international law reasons, it would be very difficult for the United States to aid in those types of development.
Let me also, some great questions here. And one, this one says that your whole argument is based on the economic power and continued thriving of nation. But some economists believe that China will begin to slow down and could stagnate or falter. Does that change your predictions or analysis?
So first, I will say that I'm not an economist, and it is. I see a lot of debate about this, and I've seen debate about this for the past 20 years. That economists on both sides, and I don't even remember, if Jean remembers in her course, I remember this was like, kind of early WTO days when she would lecture about, how's the Chinese economy going to react when they have to open the doors to foreign banks, right? Like I still remember that lecture being like, oh, that they're never going to get through that, right? So I would just say anecdotally, that the past 20 years, I've heard these arguments of like, oh yes, but price reform, they can never get through that. And oh yes, floating the currency, less currency manipulation, they can never get through that. And financial crisis, and they always seem to manage. So I will just say that I don't have the ability to assess which side of the economist debate is correct. I will say that even stagnation, some of these slowdowns still put China as the largest economy in the world for the foreseeable future, even if they aren't growing at the same rate. So they still would have economic power in that respect. And just as a strategist, I am reluctant to go down the route of like, if it's worse, let's just say the Chinese economy collapsed or something, it's like a Soviet Union style thing, which I don't think we see any indications of. But I think that leads to lazy strategy. I mean, I have to say that for many years, people did not want to, like, my sense is that people did not want to spend the time coming up with how to compete with China, because they would say, oh, no, I don't have to worry about that. The problem's going to go away on its own. So maybe it will go away on its own. But in the meantime, I think we have to assume it won't.
No, certainly it's not collapsing, but even without the collapse, there are a lot of demand on funding. And so obviously for doing the type of military development that you're talking about, it's going to take money away from some very necessary things, including social services, education, health, an aging population and such. Do you sense that there's this type of resistance?
So there's sort of two sides to this. I do sense that the Chinese leadership is sensitive to that. I'll just sort of give an example. So sometimes on social media, some things are censored that call for the Chinese military to be more involved in things. So like when Chinese citizens are kidnapped abroad or something like this, there's a lot of this discussion on social media of like, why are we the United States pushes China around about something, that a Chinese netizen will be like, why are we spending all this money on the military if we cannot use it? And the fact that these comments are consistently censored, shows to me that there's this kind of sensitivity to, yes, we are spending a lot of money on this, which goes back to my point that I think Xi Jinping doesn't want to lose. And because if he lost, then the Chinese people would be like, why did we spend all this money on this military and we still lost? So I think there is a domestic political sensitivity to that. But to date, given, the growth of their economy and the size of their economy, they've been able to invest in both guns and butter. The question of the Chinese people's resolve comes up a lot. Like, the average Chinese person, is used to this more prosperous world. Are they going to be willing, like, what if there's costs associated with conflict? Like, are they going to be willing to bear them? And I don't know. And I think Xi Jinping doesn't know. When I talk to Chinese military leaders, they always say, we have a long history of like shiku, right? Of like eating bitterness, and the Chinese people will like fight to the very end, but who knows? I mean, it's not only the Chinese people, but the Chinese military. It is extremely difficult to train people to run towards bullets instead of away from them. This is something that the United States is very good at. No one questions, no commander in the United States questions whether their troops will like adhere to orders in wartime. But a Chinese commander, and some internal writings have suggested, have great uncertainty about this. So I don't really know. And I think she doesn't know. And this is what imposes caution on the leadership. These are the types of things that we should be kind of reminding him of, let's say.
There's a question changing slightly. It says, if we need to prepare for more non-military types of coercive Chinese behavior, i.e., do we try to broaden our definition of national security to address non-traditional challenges, or do we security folks take a step back and reallocate resources towards strengthening diplomatic and economic arms of U.S. power?
I think the first is I think we have to expand our definition of like our alliance relationship. And so in that case, if it means that we have to say that economic coercion is a threat to national security, we can go that route. I also just think it's, general protection of our allies and partners. We can just expand the definition of protection beyond military attack to other forms of attack on their societies, on their economic systems, or what have you. But to the general point of, should we be giving more money to like other parts of the government? I mean, absolutely. I teach this course, International Security in the Changing World, at Stanford, and I had some of these statistics up of like, 1% of the military budget is like what we've spent on healthcare over like the past how many decades. I mean, it is pretty amazing. And I'm working on a book right now about how China competes differently. And one thing that they do is they, look at for the blind spots or the weaknesses in U.S. competition, and that's where they go. So they're not even trying to compete with us directly in most areas, right? So while we're going around the world being like, we want to be the external security partner of choice and we want to train all the militaries of the world and therefore they'll be our friends and we're going to sell them all these weapons and they'll be our friends. China's like, okay, have fun with that, guys. Like, we're not going to do that. So in the competition realm, they are competing by saying, okay, yeah, like have the United States, train your military. Great. Like, here's some Belt and Road money. Do you also want to be our friend? So I think we do have to, what the Biden administration is saying now, expand our domestic competitive base by investing more in education, healthcare, all these types of things to make us domestically strong and competitive, and then expand how we think about power and influence beyond the military tools. But military deterrence is the foundation for that. We should absolutely be leading by diplomacy and multilateral organizations. All of that has to be central, but we can only do that if we have a foundation of deterrence in place.
This is a somewhat related question, and this is one of the pillars of the Kantian peace, is the claim that economic integration is stabilizing and will make peaceful relations more likely. Compared to the USSR in the Cold War, China is a leading market and trading partner of most countries in the region, and you pointed that out. Logic would lead us to expect that the region would be more peaceful and stable than during the Cold War. And it goes on to say, and in fact, we have seen so far much less hot conflict in the region since 1989. China has not been involved in a war since 1979. So do you see the current environment as more destabilizing than during the Cold War?
So the first thing I will say about the Kantian piece is I had an article a couple of years ago in Survival in which I went through the three kind of mechanisms that political scientists, the three main ways that economic ties are meant to prevent war, and basically show that none of those are applicable in the case of China and the United States. So things like, people-to-people relations, the more we interact, the more we're supposed to understand and like each other. All polls show that the opposite is happening between China and the United States and China and other countries in the region. When it comes to like the costs of conquest, which is another sort of argument that it no longer makes sense for you to take over some sort of territory because you can benefit from its production through trade. A lot of these territories we're talking about are unoccupied, so there are no costs of conquest associated with them in the same way. And then, the trade, it has to do with perceptions. I think in any sort of conflict, there's an expectation, and research shows this is generally the case. There'd be a decrease in trade for like 5 to 7 years, but then returning to pre-war levels. And so the question is, historically, do leaders tend to prioritize core national security concerns or economic concerns? And for the most part, it's security concerns. For the most part, they are willing to pay very high economic costs for the sake of security. Now, we haven't had a war in Asia, as the questionnaire mentioned, in a couple of decades, but Asian countries have undergone now, besides China, military modernization and military buildups. Asia now buys more weapons, as a couple of years ago, buys more weapons than Europe does. And so we do see huge military buildups happening across the region. It's just that military modernization takes time. A lot of these nations were new nations, like in a kind of post-colonial period. And so now I think we're entering into a new period in which military capabilities are playing a much greater role in the state-to-state interaction. And for those reasons, military options are becoming more available. I do see it as a more destabilizing or conflict-prone region than it has been in the past.
Let me just throw in here this question about not the conflict. In China, this is the possibility of active conflict between China and India in the near time, and what might be the rationale. There are already these skirmishes they've been engaged in. So you think anything's going to develop from that?
Yeah, I have to say that what happened over the summer with China and India was very confusing to me. Like as someone who studies Chinese strategy, because the Indian border was never, kind of seen as a key component of China's road to rejuvenation. I mean, even in China, I did this whole study looking at Chinese media coverage, official media coverage of Indian military modernization. And it's so interesting that for the most part, the Chinese basically underestimate Indian military capabilities. And even when India is engaging in aggressive behavior, the reporting kind of gives them an out, right? While Japan engages in a military exercise with the United States, Chinese reporting, talks about the remilitarization of Japan and the threat to China. India does an exercise with the United States, and the Chinese media is like, oh, poor India being manipulated again by the United States. Like they've always seen India different. I mean, the majority of the Chinese people don't even know that China and India fought a war. I've been in Chinese bookstores looking for wars about 1962, which, by the way, China won handedly. So you'd think they would be talking about all the time. It's not even there. So I always kind of saw the India situation as different than these other territorial conflicts. And so kind of Chinese aggression on that border was very strange because it seemed to me like there were a lot of risks and downsides, and not a lot of upside. So sort of what I've come down on is this idea, that China has a heightened sensitivity to what they perceive as other countries potentially taking advantage of domestic weaknesses. And so one of their strategies of deterrence is to actively use force or be aggressive in order to enhance the credibility that they are willing to use force. It's kind of a weird deterrent mindset, but that's how they show credibility, is they just kind of do it. So during like COVID, for example, there was a lot of discussion of fears of other countries taking advantage. And so they wanted to preempt that by being overly aggressive. I think if you look at Chinese force posture, like they have not moved forces, like they're not adequately preparing for land-based contingencies on the Indian border. All their military reforms are moving away from army-centric type of stuff to enable air and sea type of battles. And so it seems to me like, that's not a huge priority for them, and it wouldn't make much sense to be, fighting a land-based conflict right now, given that. But states do crazy things. So that's not a very satisfying answer, I think. I would just say that it is quite confusing about what's going on between China and India.
So you would, based on what you've said, then sort of did it for example, so that particularly during COVID, but given that China has sort of gotten over, we think, the hump of COVID, do you think that this will then just sort of die away?
In terms of the China-India stuff, yeah, I think in general, they think that the Indians, try to take advantage of them at times, and they have to like stand up to it. I think it is more of a domestic political sensitivity, especially given that the regions of those border disputes, are minority regions that the Chinese are trying to consolidate control over. So I think it has a much more, in some ways, emotional component than it would otherwise. They're worried that, countries like India and then the United States through India are trying to, whip up domestic unrest or something. And so they really have to have control over those areas.
We have a questioner that is challenging a bit your analysis of this, that China doesn't ask much except neutrality. And saying that China engages both economically and geographically with its neighbors is quite aggressive and tend to scare away or alienate them, especially in the South China Sea. Hence, we could conclude that China could fail to preserve neutrality in the region in the case of a US-China confrontation. And the questioner wants to know your opinion of that type of analysis.
I love hearing that. And I hear it all the time, like China has overplayed their hand. And like this time, everyone, like they're so aggressive and threatening, and everyone has come to the conclusion that they're aggressive and threatening. And now, the United States, they're going to be more welcoming to the United States or what have you. And I wonder, how much of that is a bit of wishful thinking, because at least in the region, even in Southeast Asia, even with like Vietnam, which has been mulling over, bringing their claims again to an international tribunal. Like Indonesia won't even admit that China claims their territory. Like we're not even at the point. Like they don't even want to say it. It's not like so. Yes, I think China has been aggressive, and countries don't like it. But I think I'm not as optimistic as the questioner that like. Southeast Asian countries have now been like, oh, we're on the side, this cannot stand, and it's better to have the United States in the region. I would say, and this again is anecdotal, but I was in Southeast Asia relatively recently, I guess given COVID, so this was a little less than a year ago, talking to some governments about this precise issue. And there was a very disturbing line of argument that emerged. And again, this was only a handful of people, so I don't mean to suggest it's everyone, but I asked them, if you are 100% confident that the United States would, fight China in the South China Sea, right, would come to your aid, and we would protect your claims there or whatever, would you then side with the United States now and to help us? And the viewpoint was no. That if they had to choose between a war between China and the United States, in which the United States did win, but there was a war nonetheless, or a world in which they accommodated China's position, they would prefer to accommodate China's position. And so if this is true, and that a lot of Southeast Asian countries think, and I said, and assume that once China has control over the South China Sea, they are restricting your access to fisheries, oil, they have more coercive power against you that they're going to use. Even in this world, they didn't want to fight a war against China. And so I think that this narrative of like China's overplayed their hand, and either they'll moderate their behavior or like everyone is now going to come together against them. I've heard it many times before, but I don't actually see a lot of evidence on the ground that something significant enough to impact China's strategic thinking is coalescing.
Okay. Good. Let me ask you, our time is almost running out, but I wanted to ask you this question. So on the one hand, it's quite clear, and I agree that, certainly you say the basis of a relationship has to be this security. But if the administration, if in U.S.-China relations, the economic issues became less hot, and we were able to come to some workable arrangements, would that affect the behavior, for example, of China invading Taiwan, that their need to show that they could invade Taiwan?
So I tend to think of the causality going in the other direction, in that I think that the economic tensions are the result of the security tension. It is because we have this military competition and this tech competition that has now permeated, into the business community and the trade relationship, that now the economic power of China has taken on a new viewpoint. And so in this hypothetical scenario, I guess if China, changed its approach to economic relations with countries, right, now competed fairly and, didn't force technology transfer, all this stuff, it might have an impact in that it would signal significant, meaningful changes in Chinese leadership strategy, right? We might think like something has happened that, made in China 2025 is out the door, economic tools out the door, there has been some major change. We don't know why, but we should try to leverage that into positive changes in the security realm. So I think it would have to be significant enough. It couldn't just be like, okay, now they've agreed to buy more of our airplanes, which they wanted anyway.
Let me end by throwing this question to you about, that President Biden is now left to sort of clean up and decide on a number of policies, bans and such against Huawei and a number of other Chinese tech companies. So what advice would you give to the administration about perhaps the best way to go in terms of trying to diffuse, improve relations as well as deter Chinese aggression?
Well, deterrence is a combination of credible threats and assurance. right? I've talked a lot about credible threats today. The Trump administration was very good at issuing threats and making them credible. I think President Obama was very good at assuring countries like China that the United States did not have some sort of vendetta against them, right? As long as China behaved in a responsible way, the United States would welcome it into the international system. You need both, because right now in Beijing, I think there's this view of, the United States is not going to accept a more powerful China, no matter how we behave and no matter how we seek our views. Like, I think the view in Beijing is that this is structural, that the United States feels threatened by Chinese power. And so it doesn't matter, how China uses or exercises that power. And that is a hard world to shape Chinese behavior. So I think the Biden administration absolutely has to go back to the drawing board, keep some of those credible threats in place, but rebuild the assurance with Beijing. So for example, when we talk about political interference or banning Huawei, we have to be reasonable in how we define these things and tell Beijing what types of activities are appropriate. Because I've been, I'm part of some discussions in which taking a think tanker out to lunch and asking them about their views on the South China Sea is like Chinese political interference and espionage, which it is not, right? Or every Chinese student or educational thing is like the Chinese government trying to, brainwash American citizens. It is not. And so part of the assurance has to be very clear with Beijing of there are ways you can pursue your interests and build powers that the United States will accept. And here are what those are, right? This is what we consider political interference. This is what we consider acceptable. Because from China's point of view, they were, they're like, well, you told us just not to use force. You never told us we couldn't buy inserts in U.S. newspapers to promote our cause. So where do we fall on this? So I think that needs to be the starting point, is much more clarity on expectations on both sides.
Well, I just want to say this is, it was a great session. You answered some really tough questions, and we're so happy to have you back at Stanford. So I want to thank you, but also thank our audience for all these wonderful questions. And we hope to see you again in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much, Oriana.